Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
The media keep us informed and help us form our opinions. Our guest today, Jonathan Sacerdoti, is a leading British journalist with expertise on the Middle East, race relations, and anti Semitism. He appears in news shows around the world, such as the BBC, Fox News, and I-24 News, and he writes for The Spectator, The Jewish Chronicle, and others. Jonathan is also campaigner against anti-Semitism. Jonathan, thank you for coming on our show. Welcome.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Today, I get to ask the first question. So in your article in The Express on October 11th, 2023, you described the unimaginable hateful brutality of the October 7th attacks as comparable with the hate and the brutality of the Nazis against the Jews. We understand that you are a Holocaust survivor's descendant. Do you think this hate displayed by the Hamas terrorists is representative of how the general Palestinian population in Gaza and in the West Bank and Israel view the Jews?
Well, in that article, which was written, as you say, just a few days after the horrors themselves took place, I don't think I was necessarily trying to draw a straight line between the two or a direct comparison. But I, like many journalists, I think, was searching for some way of describing the extent of the horrors of what had happened. And I think that in the media and writing from London, where I do, I'm used to seeing reports of war in Israel and around Israel, involving Israel, and attacks and terror attacks, and people here shrugging it off as normal, just another terror attack, what happens in that part of the world, or even worse, somehow deserved or justified. And it was clear, I think, to every Jewish person waking up that day, hearing that news, that this was none of those things. Not that previous terror attacks were either, but that this was something on a completely different scale. And as you said, I am the son of a Holocaust survivor. My late father, who died a few years ago now, but he was a child in Italy at the time of the war, lived under the racial laws in Italy. And at the age of 5, he was actually, thank God, saved from being sent to the camps because his father, a rabbi in Florence, had organized for the local Catholic clergy to look after him and his younger 3-year-old brother. And I sometimes mention that in these contexts because I think it's important to look at those moments in history. And the Holocaust is a sort of touch point of horror and anti-Semitism for many of us. But if you've got this sort of direct experience of growing up with someone who could tell you about that, I learned two things. One is of the horrors, but the other is of the wonderful, selfless, extraordinary, and yet very ordinary people who saved Jewish lives. And I've always said that by extension, those nuns and those priests who saved my father, he was in hiding in a convent at first for 2 weeks until it was stormed by the Nazi fascists. And then he was moved to an orphanage in the countryside in Tuscany. And he stayed there for 9 months, hiding and pretending to be one of the Catholic orphans. And I always say that those people saved my life as well as his, because obviously I wouldn't have been born if had my father not survived the war. So why do I mention all that? Because I think that one of the things that's interesting about October the 7th is that it wasn't just Hamas terrorists, Nukba forces who stormed over the border. It was also ordinary Palestinians, ordinary citizens of Gaza. And there was something very striking about not just the scale of the attacks, but also the nature of who was carrying them out. And I saw that from the word go. I watched every single video I could watch as it unfolded and since, because I thought that it was really my responsibility as a journalist, but also as a citizen of the world, to see exactly what happened. I felt it was, to me at least, like the Holocaust, that I had a responsibility to bear witness to what had happened, to see it with my own eyes. And unlike the Holocaust, I got to see it in real time or close to real time. They filmed it, they streamed it, they put it on Telegram, they put it on Facebook.
Can we
These
just
images and
clarify?
videos were there for everyone to
I
see.
want to clarify for our audience who might have short memories. Hamas filmed their atrocities in real time. So the
Yeah.
they is Hamas, and then shared it with the world.
Some of them, in fact, didn't just film it and share it, some of them streamed it. There are stories of people being killed and it being streamed to their own Facebook for their family to watch because the terrorists picked up their phones, presumably went into their Facebook app and clicked on go live so that their family would get an alert to say that grandma is going live. And unfortunately, when they tuned in, what they saw was not something anyone would want to see. That is my understanding. So I think that the level of glee that they took in that brutality, in that sort of savageness, was something that did have echoes of the Holocaust, but it's not the same thing. And I didn't want to make those comparisons per se, but I think that we all reached for, references that could maybe communicate to a wider public what it was we were witnessing, what was unfolding. And then, of course, there was a sense that what would come afterwards would be enormous, and it was important that people would understand why. I think they've forgotten all too quickly what happened.
So, do you think the world, the public, understood what happened there? Do they know what you know, what you've seen, or is that somehow stayed out of the public awareness somewhat?
I
The
think that
atrocities.
I do think that everybody heard about it, if they're news consumers, and I think there was no shortage of coverage of it. But I think that perhaps people have short memories, and that's to be charitable. I think many of them have chosen to put it to the back of their minds or to forget it. And I
I
also
have a
think,
quick question.
go ahead, sure.
The news has changed in terms of headlines, and I used to be a print journalist 1,000 years ago, and a headline is a very important element. But I think in the beginning in the UK, the headlines were what we might say pro-Israel, meaning reporting what really happened. And now 10 months later, 10 or 11 months later, have the headlines changed in terms of how they're worded?
I think there's been an interesting shift in the coverage, and I think it's something that we've seen forever, as long as I can remember. And that is that the news, I can certainly speak for the UK, but I think it's a common thing to many Western media outlets. There is a tendency here in the news to explain and report on wars in a really idiosyncratic way. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Here on the BBC, for example, but also on others, on Sky News and most of the news channels here, you'll see a particular type of news reporting on wars where they're not really reporting on the war or the grand strategy of either side or the military actions or the victories, the battles. What they tend to do is zoom in on individual stories of misery, of individuals caught up in the war. Now, I understand why that's happened. I think it's a very natural human thing to want to concentrate on those people involved. And in a way, that's one of the things that victims of war always ask for. Look what's happening to us. We don't deserve this. We're caught up in this. But what it does is it completely distorts the wider picture. And I think there's a responsibility for the news to do both. So we have a constant stream of effectively misery porn coming out of war zones where we see people and suffering, and the journalists often see it as their job to maximize the portrayal of that suffering and to look at the micro suffering, one individual person or one individual family. So we've seen a lot of stories like that, and it's problematic not just because it doesn't give you the bigger picture, but also because in cases like this war, it's often completely fake as well. So the reporting from Gaza, we hear constantly the complaint that journalists, Western journalists, can't get into Gaza unless they're accompanied in on an embed with the IDF. And that means they're reliant on journalists in Gaza sending them material. And that obviously that material is at the mercy of Hamas censors, and if not directly censored, local journalists, even if they wanted to tell the truth, can't, because they'll get killed or tortured or arrested for doing so. So what it means is that this stream of individual, what they call human interest stories, comes out, and people at home are seeing that, and you wouldn't be human if you didn't see those stories and feel extremely sad. So if there was a large amount of sympathy for the images of Israelis and others in Israel suffering on October the 7th, then you would expect a similar level of sympathy for Palestinians suffering, and quite rightly so. But I think that the news has a responsibility to contextualize all of that much better, to give all the caveats I just did about, you know, whether it's accurate, what you're seeing is real. There's been some absolutely manufactured bits of news out of Gaza, totally debunked. But of course, there's loads of suffering there as well, and war is horrible and ugly. And so I think the fact that it's focused on those misery stories from Gaza, often glossed over some pretty horrific stories from Israel as well. But Israel is suffering less because Israel is a democratic Western country that emphasizes protecting its civilians rather than using them as a protection. It builds public shelters and makes it compulsory to build shelters in homes rather than building military and terrorist tunnels under homes. You know, the two are so contrasting that it's no wonder Israel has fewer of those stories. And also, Israel's a much stronger country, a country with a very strong military, and obviously Gaza with Hamas is not comparable in that sense. So I think that's part of the problem. But yes, I do think there was a shift. I do think that people around the world have been influenced massively by that, and I think that's a massive shame, which is why I've always tried, to some extent in my analysis of the war, to focus not only on those individual stories, which are important, but also to focus on what's going on in the wider picture, what's going on in the strategy. You know, all of that, all eyes on Rafah, that was going around on social media at one point, that, you know, Israel shouldn't invade Rafah, Israel shouldn't move into Rafah. Well, you know, I just seen today that they declared that they've destroyed basically the Rafah battalion, and it was all done in a fairly exemplary way in terms of warcraft. Yes, there were civilian casualties, no doubt, but Israel did evacuate the majority of the civilians from Rafah very effectively, in a way that, for example, Kamala Harris said they would never be able to. It did conduct itself within Rafah in a way that seems to me to have been in line with international law, and it did achieve apparently most of the military aims within Rafah, but you wouldn't know that from watching any of the massively biased and warped news reports that you get here in the UK and elsewhere around the world.
Right, right. So an important element in the whole decision Israel has to make on when to end the war, whether or not to allow the founding of a Palestinian state, is one important element is the question: how many Palestinians actually support or behind what happened on October 7, on what Hamas did on October 7 and how they did it? In other words, how big of a proportion of the Palestinian people want to annihilate Jewish Israelis?
Among those
Do you have any
videos
information on that?
that I watched were, among those videos that I watched were some of, as I said, so-called ordinary Palestinian citizens who had also breached the border into Israel on October the 7th. And that was one of the more striking things for me to see, because what it showed me was the level of anger, but also vicious bloodthirstiness in certain parts of Palestinian civilian society in Gaza. I watched, for example, a video of a Palestinian man, clearly not one of the Nukba forces. He was in, I think, some kind of sandals. He had no weapons on him, but he'd managed to get hold of an agricultural tool, a sort of hoe, and he was bludgeoning a foreign worker in one of the kibbutzim to death with it, and he wanted to cut his head off with it. He was unsuccessful despite landing think I counted 7 or 8 blows. I'd have to go back and rewatch it now to be sure. And he was adamant that he wanted his friend to film it as well, so that he would have it on record. Now, that's just one video. I think we all saw the videos of hostages and corpses being taken back into Gaza on October the 7th as well. Some pretty horrific ones, stamping on dead bodies, spitting on dead or nearly dead bodies, naked bodies, female hostages who certainly looked like they had been raped or sexually abused, bleeding in the crotch with blood around their sweatpants. All of these horrible things that I'm sorry to have to bring up in details like that. But I saw ordinary Gazan civilians celebrating. I saw ordinary Gazan civilians crowding around those vehicles, cheering and joining in the beatings or spitting on people who were alive or dead, taken hostage from Israel. And that did make me, as well as many other people around the world, wonder what your ordinary Gazan civilian thinks. And I, again, go back to the story of my father. My father was saved by nuns, ordinary people, but with extraordinary souls and hearts and ethics and morals. And those people have been recognized by Yad Vashem in Israel, the Holocaust Memorial Organization, under Israel's Yad Vashem law, which was introduced very early on in the state's history, as righteous among the nations. Those are people who, at risk to their own lives, non-Jews, saved Jewish people during the Holocaust. Where are the righteous among the Palestinians at the moment who have helped hostages to escape? Where are the righteous at the moment who have tipped off the Israeli army about hostages being kept near them? Instead, actually, what we've seen is that hostages who've been rescued or released have told us that they were kept in the homes of civilians who were doing it for small amounts of money. And that is the very opposite of those righteous people that saved my father and many, many other Jewish people during the Holocaust. So I looked at polling, and polling has sadly shown that the feeling among Palestinian society, not just in Gaza, but actually in the West Bank as well, in Judea and Samaria, is quite supportive of what Hamas has done and quite supportive of terrorism. And even the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority in the disputed territories in the West Bank has for years now paid salaries to terrorists who've killed Jews in terror attacks and their families. It seems to me that it is hardwired into their society to despise and hate and kill Jewish people and Israelis, and that it's hardwired into their society to admire those who do that and to aspire to it. And just as a journalist, since October the 7th, I've done many interviews with various people. Two stand out in relation to this. One was with a Palestinian woman who is, according to her, the first female brewmaster of beer in the Middle East. She is a Palestinian in the West Bank who makes beer. And we talked a lot about her entrepreneurial business and all of those things and her visions of a modern Palestinian state one day. But when I asked her about the rape of women on October the 7th at the hands of Palestinian terrorists, at the hands of Hamas, she found it impossible to properly condemn it, and instead told me that Palestinian women have often found it very difficult at checkpoints and experienced difficulty like that at the hands of Israelis, as if that somehow justified the rape of anyone on October the 7th. And the other interview that I remember doing since the 7th was a guy called Dor Shachar. And Dor Shachar is he's now a Jewish Israeli, but he was actually born a Muslim Palestinian in Gaza. And at the age of 13, he escaped from Gaza. This is before the disengagement. So his father used to come into Israel and work in Israel, and he brought his son in one day with him, and his son ran away. And it's a very interesting story. The guy converted to Judaism, and he felt that he was escaping from a society which had brought him up to worship death and murder. He told me horrible stories about what went on around him in Gaza. He told me that they, I've heard this before from experts, but never from the people who were being taught in the schools, that they taught him maths with, as a child, with books that said things like, if I have 5 Jews and I kill 3, how many are left? 2, and we'll kill them too soon. These sorts of things are staggering to hear, but they also make you realize that it's not surprising that while Israel was educating its young people, my husband's Israeli, he grew up in Tel Aviv. He went to a school that prioritized coexistence and educating Arabs alongside Jews in Jaffa. He was taught all about the two-state solution and the vision of peace in the future. Like many generations of Israelis, his parents hoped he wouldn't have to go into the army. And actually, he said to me, that feels like nonsense now after October the 7th, because the very people who stormed over the border and killed and kidnapped and raped are his age and younger. And while they were being taught about peace and coexistence, these people clearly weren't being. They were being taught something very different. And that's why, I suppose, there is a massive problem within Palestinian public opinion, and why, when you look at polling, you see that there isn't really an education towards peace and coexistence and a desire to create 2 states. If there had been, they would have taken one of the many opportunities to create a Palestinian state that could live alongside Israel. They haven't, because I don't believe personally, especially post October the 7th, that truly is the aim of the Palestinian liberation movement or the Palestinian nationalism movement. That's not their aim. Their aim is to have no Jewish state.
And no Jews.
Well, presumably, yes. I mean, if the Jews can't be in Israel, one has to wonder where those millions of people will indeed go.
It kind of to switch subjects, but of course connected. What has been your experience before October 7th and now after with anti-Semitism in the UK? You and I had talked about it earlier, and I'd like you to share a couple of things that you said to me beforehand really have stayed with me. So go ahead and share it.
Well, I grew up here in London. I feel very British. I was born in Britain. Obviously, my father was Italian. My mother was born in Britain. Her mother was born in Britain, but beyond that, her father wasn't. Her father was born in Eastern Europe, and her mother's family also. So like many Jews, I am the product of immigration here, but I also benefited from the very best that Britain had to offer. I went to great school. I went to a great university. I didn't go to Jewish schools. I went to wholeheartedly brand name establishment British educational institutions. And I really felt that the anti-Semitism I was taught about firsthand from my father, and also in history, was exactly that, historical. I don't think I realized growing up that this was something that still existed until I experienced it myself. And I think that many people have had that moment much more recently than I did. I think a lot of Jewish people I know here have had that moment on October the 7th, actually, and since. But I had it much younger. It was when I went to university. And at university, I think I experienced my first conscious exposure to anti-Semitism. It was when, in fact, the Debating Society had chosen to invite David Irving, the Holocaust denier, to speak. And there was, of course,
Now, let's just remind our audience that Deborah Lipstadt, who's currently the United States Special Envoy of Anti-Semitism, was sued by David Irving for calling him a Holocaust denial in her book. And there was a court case in London. Okay, now continue.
And in fact, she won, which is why we can say that he is a Holocaust denier, because
yes, exactly.
he sued her for libel and she won. And the point is that David Irving, who is a revisionist historian, if one can call him a historian, a denier of the horrors of the Holocaust, had been invited to speak. And so, of course, many
Wait,
Jewish
and he
students.
was invited while the trial was going on. Am I correct?
I can't,
Or
you know,
around?
we are looking back a few years, so to my university years. I can't tell you. I'm pretty sure it was post the trial, actually, but I may be wrong. Um, he was certainly, there was no secrecy about what he was and who he was.
That's what I mean. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. No, he was invited because of his infamy, not despite it. And I think that, the campaign to not hold this event was characterized by some really ugly incidents in my experience. So that's where I'm going with that. And I think that that really opened my eyes. I suddenly thought, well, these people around me who are my contemporaries, these people at this, top university in the world, are actually anti-Semites. Some of them, not all of them, and they were not just anti-Semites. They were anti-Semites who were happy to express it openly and publicly to my face and in front of an audience as we discussed this and debated whether or not he should be there. So the invitation was rescinded as it should have been, but the point was that my eyes had been opened, and then this is what I think many people have experienced here since October the 7th. Once my eyes were open, I looked backwards and I saw many more instances during my childhood and growing up when I thought, oh my, was that anti Semitism? Oh, I remember being treated differently in that moment. Was that anti Semitism? And it all reminds me of that old saying, which is anti Semitism is disliking the Jews more than is strictly necessary. And I think that's a very sort of British thing, is the idea that the establishment probably did have a latent or ingrained element of anti-Semitism in its attitudes. And Jewish Brits like myself had sort of grown up with that as our normal. So we almost didn't see it or didn't feel it. In fact, even accepted it. We're different. Sometimes we might have to behave differently or expect to be treated differently. So I think that there has long been an element of anti-Semitism in established British society, probably elsewhere around the world as well. But I think that at moments like now, and since October the 7th, it can burst out into the open, to the surface. And obviously, it gets better and worse at different times. It's certainly got a lot worse at the moment when you have groups, mobs, I would rather call them, parading down the streets here week after week after week, chanting genocidal chants about Jewish people, chanting in Arabic, singing Arabic war songs or blaring them through speakers, calling for jihad on the streets. And then, you see, when you find that the police don't act, or the police, as they did here, suggest that jihad can have more than one meaning, or that some of these people aren't arrestable because understood in the context, what they're saying is somehow acceptable. All these horror stories start to come out. And then Jews, I think, suddenly realize, oh, wow, that was a light sleeper. It's not new. It was always here, and it's been awoken. And I just add one last thing, which is to say, one hears a lot that analogy of anti-Semitism being like a virus. I know it's often attributed to the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Dr. Jonathan Sacks, that anti-Semitism, like a virus, has mutated through the generations. And at the time when it was, basically Jews are always accused of breaching whatever is the holiest, most valued idea or value of the era. So when science was in that position, Jews were racially impure in a sort of scientific way, and that now it's to do with Jews having a nation. I mean, I've rather butchered his telling of it there, but the reason I mention it is I only like that analogy up to a point. I don't think it is like a virus, because a virus is something that you contract involuntarily. We just lived through the COVID pandemic, and we all became familiar with trying not to catch COVID. You don't catch anti-Semitism. Yes, there is a sort of social contagion with things like that, but we're all conscious, thinking human beings, and this is really one of the things I'm very particular about. I feel the same when I hear about people being radicalized. We often hear that in the news here about terrorists. They were radicalized online or in such and such a mosque. To a certain extent, it's true, but each one of us has free will. Each one of us has the capacity for critical thought. And I think it's letting people off far too easily to say that they contracted the virus of anti Semitism or were radicalized against a particular group. It is both an active and a passive activity to become a racist.
So how would you explain then the outburst of global anti-Semitism since October 7? And do you feel Jewish organizations are standing up to it in the right way?
Explaining it is really difficult, as you will both know from doing this podcast for long enough. To me, it's obviously inexplicable. Racism is so inexplicable to decent thinking people that it's hard to understand and put oneself in the mind of a racist. And yet we must. So, why do I think it's happened? I think part of it touches on what I mentioned before, which is if all you see on the news are images of babies dying and children evacuating their homes and such like, then it is inevitable that you'll be emotionally moved. And if you're then given the narrative constantly on top of that, that this is being done because of these people, Jews, Israelis, who are wantonly and unnecessarily and indiscriminately and disproportionately targeting those people, then I suppose it is understandable that you might, with the best of intentions, end up disliking or hating or feeling vitriolic towards Jewish people. But as I said, I think that today we're very lucky in that we live in an era when we don't need to rely just on the narratives fed to us by the news. There was a time when editors, 5 or 6 editors of newspapers and the nightly TV news had that power over us. They filtered everything we saw. But I'm a great believer in casting one's net far and wide today and doing one's own research. I'm, as a journalist, bound to do that for my work, but ordinary consumers can do it as well. I'm in dozens of Telegram groups. Telegram is a free app you can download, a bit like WhatsApp for anyone that doesn't know, but you can subscribe to groups. I read Hamas updates, I read IDF updates, I read individual updates from Gaza and elsewhere. I read updates from the Arab world. Telegram will even automatically translate them, so language is no longer a barrier. Before that happened, some years back, I used to read the news from different countries, first where there were English language websites, secondly, once automated translation happened using that. We have the ability to read and research things massively and widely. And yes, we need to learn about fake news and being influenced that way unduly as well. But I think that we can tell ourselves to a certain extent what is and isn't right. And the more that we consume of that, the better, because we can make our own decisions. And it's one of the reasons I am very much in favor of what Elon Musk is doing with X, for example, formerly Twitter, because I do think that there is a sort of stranglehold over people's news consumption, and he is in some ways breaking it with this website, though it comes with its own problems because there's copious amounts of anti-Semitism on platforms as well. When you take away the filters, everything gets through. So that's part of it. But again, I'm always of the opinion that I'd rather know about these anti-Semites living around me. One of the things about the protests was I saw these people come out in the streets of London. Yes, it's horrible, but thank God I now know that they live among us. These are my co-citizens. They are Londoners like me, and they maybe hate me.
I would like to share a British anecdote because it's much more basic. Many of the most famous British novels in the last, let's say, 100 years have the typical British anti-Semitism in them, the way they referred to a Jew as a moneylender. So before October 7th, 3 or 4 years ago, certain books that I really like of a certain author were reissued. And the anti-Semitism statements were blatant and had nothing to do with the plot. So I wrote to the British publisher and I said, I think it would be really nice. I don't know if I used the word nice to remove these. They have nothing to do with the plot. And, they extend the view of Jew as usurer, etc. This was my answer. Oh, no, we can't change it. The estate probably wouldn't like it. That's famous British novels being sold over and over again. No one would ever suspect that they're anti-Semitic, but that is the kind of information that is subtly being spread throughout the world. So what can we do? It's so subtle.
I sympathize. I mean, perhaps a bit of a digression for us, but I'm not massively in favor of rewriting anti-Semitic texts either. I'm more in favor of acknowledging them, reading about them, discussing them. Sometimes where something is wantonly anti-Semitic, and that's kind of its entire point, I do question why people would choose to publish it or make it available. I'm not in favor massively of cancel culture.
No, I
But I
wasn't.
think
You understand?
I'm not accusing. I'm not.
No,
I
I
don't mean
love
to
these
accuse
books,
you. Yeah,
but the 3 references, which had
were
nothing to do with the plot.
were irrelevant. Yes, no, and I hear you. I think that it's a really difficult idea to know how we deal with these things. So I think that, and personally, I don't believe anti-Semitism will ever go away. In the same way that I don't think racism will ever go away. I think it's to some extent human nature, but I think that another thing that is human nature is our ability to think and to make decisions and to learn and to improve ourselves and to broaden our horizons and experience and meet more cultures and people, and in that way we become richer people who appreciate one another more rather than have distrust or suspicion about one another, and therefore angry feelings towards one another. Um, but I do think that's human nature. So I think it's important that we acknowledge it where we see it, and that we contextualize it when it's historical and understand it. I think that there's a balance to be struck with all of these things. And going back to the question of why I think that this wave of anti-Semitism has sort of come about now, I think a large part of it is a reluctance to talk about the issue. I think that many Jewish people have spoken out about how they feel and what's happening now. And there has been this horrible phenomenon that many of them have just been told to shut up or they've been ignored. And that's wrong. I think that the debate needs to be had. And many of us have been talking about it for many years. More people are starting to join that conversation, which I think is a good thing. But I think that there is it's too easy to be anti-Semitic and to be racist and to be told actually that by calling it out, you are the racist. So, for example, if one tries to discuss issues of, for example, extremist Islam and anti-Semitism, you will often be told that you are Islamophobic or racist against Muslims. But I don't think that it is unreasonable for Jewish people or non-Jewish people or Western people to question the more problematic parts of any faith, especially when those problematic parts of some faiths end up in mass casualty terror attacks like October the 7th, but also like the Manchester Arena bombing, which I reported from for days, which killed innocent children who'd gone to see an Ariana Grande concert, or any of the other countless terror attacks which did take place in the name of extremist Islam. That is what the perpetrators said it was about, and therefore we must talk about it, however difficult or awkward it is. And because our society at the moment is willing instead to dismiss anyone that mentions it, even peacefully and intellectually and in the correct way, as far right or racist, that is an atrocious thing to do, because it means that not only do those people get silenced or worse, persecuted, but we don't get any closer to sorting out this problem. On the contrary, we encourage the perpetrators by showing them that uh, there's no cost to what they're doing, that they are able to win doing that, and that is quite wrong. I think we must, as Jews, but also non-Jews, as Westerners, we must stand up for our values, and where they clash with others, we must say so and debate it, and really do this all out in the open.
I couldn't agree more with you, that if if we say never again is now, then um, um, Islamist extremism is absolutely one of the bigger factors in the threat to the Jewish people right now.
And I think, by the way, the title of your podcast, Never Again Is Now, is very pertinent, because for me, one of the other big shocks about October the 7th was never again really does mean something to Jewish people. And the closer you are personally and directly to a Holocaust story, and most Jews are pretty close to one, at least one, at the moment. We're still, only really 1 or 2 lifetimes away from when that happened. But the closer you are, the more important those words really are. They mean something, in here, not just in here. And I think that the shocking moment of October the 7th, I wake up very early in the morning, so I watched it pretty much in real time, not quite, as the messages were coming through on my phone. We had friends that day with us here in my home who had a relative in a safe room in one of the kibbutzim hiding, a grandfather. So this was very close to me as well as it was happening. And suddenly never again didn't mean anything, because the whole concept of the state of Israel, to me and to many like me in my generation, was that it could never happen again, because now we have a state for Jewish people where Jews aren't reliant on the rest of the world to stop this, where Jews aren't reliant on the rest of the world to stop people slaughtering us. And the deeply upsetting, more than upsetting part was that it was happening again in style, not in scale, and it was happening in the very country that we believed was the reason it could never happen again. And that's why I constantly think back to October the 7th when I think about the October the 8th, Israel. Israel, since October the 8th, is a totally different place, in the sense that it knows again what its purpose is in that respect, and it may have forgotten that, and it may have lost sight of that. And now, when you go there to Israel, despite all the disagreements and all the battles and all the politics and all the rifts that might exist, there is an enormous unity among people who will say never again, and who know what the enemy they're fighting is and what it represents, and therefore who know what they have to do, however horrible it is for them and for those who get caught up in the middle. But never again means something.
Evelyn knows it very personally,
Well,
as a daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors.
yes, if we say never again, then we should ask about what is the threat today, how big is it, and what is it I can do, what should be done against it, and what is it I can do to contribute to make sure that it will happen never again. And it's a very important question to all of us today. And I think you brought us immensely important perspectives that will help us all to navigate these times for ourselves, and to help us answer the question, what is it I can do to take this threat serious and help to stop it and turn it around. So, since you are a media expert, is there something, and since you explained to us so well and clearly, that the media have such a role in forming our anti-Israeli opinions these days during this war and the wars Israel has been fighting in the past decade. Um, is there something we can do as individuals to influence the narrative of the media, or to influence the receivers of the messages of the media towards a more really honest and balanced opinion?
I think that's the important question of today. And I wish I had an easy answer, but as I'm sure you both realize, there isn't an easy answer. But that doesn't mean that we should give up. And I think it's very tempting often for us to give up, especially in our darker moments. I think plenty of us in the last 10 months or so have really felt like giving up. But I think that we do live in a moment of enormous opportunity to discuss these things and to do it in a way that can influence other people. So part of the problem is that, let's call them the other side for the sake of this conversation, also have those opportunities. But that means that the marketplace of ideas is once again quite a bustling and busy place, and the cost of entry is extremely low. Everybody, pretty much in modern Western countries, has everything they need to play their part in the debate and the discussion. And this is a great example. We're speaking to each other using technology that 20 years ago didn't exist, let alone existed in each of our pockets. So I think that the problems and troubles that we know about through social media and the internet are also the opportunities that we all benefit from in our discussions. And it requires a great deal of work on everybody's part to learn how to see what they see, to learn how to filter what they see in their own minds and how to evaluate what it means. But I don't think that means they shouldn't see it, nor that they shouldn't have conversations. And one of the more worrying tendencies of our era for me is the tendency to shut down conversation and discussion and debate, or to hold mistakes against people. So I think if we're going to open ourselves up to discussion and debate, we need also to be, to some extent, forgiving of people's incorrect
Mm.
positions or mistakes in the process of getting to where we need to be. And I'm sure I'm as guilty as others of sometimes not doing that. But I think that debate, discussion, studying, learning, sharing what we know with one another, all of these things are massively important. And none of them come without massive health warnings or complications or difficulties, and they're all massively open to manipulation. And you know, we may think that through social media we have the capacity to make up our own minds, but then the algorithm often shoves us in one direction or another without us even consciously realizing. So it's very complex, but I do think that what we're doing right now is part of the solution. And one of the reasons I am a journalist and an analyst and a commentator is very much because I think there are some really important things we need to learn about and discuss and debate. And I want to do everything I can to join in with those conversations and to disagree with people. We need to learn the art of disagreeing with one another, politely, relearn it, politely and respectfully, but also forcefully. If I believe something and I believe you're wrong, I really want to tell you and I want to persuade you. And if I can't persuade you, I want to use our conversation as an example to persuade other people at least. So I think all of those things to me are among the processes of getting us through the troubles and difficulties that we have at the moment. And I don't think it's easy at all. I'm not sure it's going to work, but what's the point in being here if we don't at least try?
Jonathan, those were lovely last words. Although if there's anything else you'd like to add as we end this show, go ahead. And really, this has been an amazing conversation.
I think, well, for me, it's been a great conversation too, and I thank you both for doing this podcast and for inviting me on. And I think, let's keep talking. I think, well, it's the best thing we can do. So thank you guys for keeping this sort of conversation going and making the opportunity for people to discuss these really, really important issues.
Thank you again. We thank our listeners, and we hope that our listeners have these conversations after hearing this episode. If you want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other efforts to fight anti-Semitism and to encourage Holocaust education, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And please, as we end every episode, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.